quick reminder, each episode could contain some game spoilers, so please listen or watch with discretion. And now, your hosts for The Gamer's Advocate, AMKomnenos, Banana, and Legion. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of The Gamer's Advocate, where we discuss as much as we can about gaming, and you get 1,000 gamers in a room, and you might get 1,000 different opinions, but we like to go over games that people love to hate and hate to love. But today, we're going to be going over a very interesting topic where game settings and maybe ones you might want to live in. Is there any video game that you can think of specifically that you might want to live in? That's going to be the theme. But before we do that, we're going to play a little game, and it's Com's turn, and we're going to do That's Nice. So Com gets to pick a game, and me and Banana have to talk at least 2 minutes. I'm going to try to make it for 3. Nothing but nice things about that game. So
I feel like this is only difficult for me. Like you are way more well equipped to say nice things about games.
As long as I know the game, then we'll see. But you never know.
This should be quite an easy one because I think there's a lot of things that you can say positively about this, even if you don't like it or you're not that familiar. So we're going to appeal to the masses, and we're going to say Elden Ring.
I'm going to let Banana go first on that one.
Well, crap. So I've only played kind of the preliminary. Well, I wouldn't even say preliminary, but very early parts of Elden Ring. I've done some exploring, and I've kind of utilized the seamless co-op mod that's available to play with people who are more experienced. And the gameplay is fun. Like it's just fun. It pretty simply put, like it takes the mechanics of Dark Souls and expands the world to the point where there's way more to experience and kind of explore. Whereas a lot of what I remember from Dark Souls 1 through 3 is not so much like linearity, because there's not that hand holding to tell you where to go, but there is kind of an order that you almost need to do things in as you're like leveling up, because the challenge just kind of guides you in specific directions. And I think with Elden Ring, the fact that it's immediately open world after the tutorial is both intimidating and a lot of fun. Because I think most modern players would kind of or seem to appreciate the open world elements of recent games. So I think they FromSoft kind of played into that appeal with Elden Ring, and I think they did a good job. You walk out those doors from that tutorial sequence, and the world is enormous. Immediately, you're kind of on a precipice looking out at just how much is there. And what you can see from that location is not the entirety of the game. It's a small portion of the game. So they did a very good job of making Dark Souls like immediately open world, but not in a way that's too intimidating. Because I struggle with open world games like that. I'd much rather have a good idea of where I need to go do. But with that game, I kind of enjoyed just exploring, and that's not really what I play games for anymore. Like I'm not a huge fan of that kind of open world element personally, but they did a really good job with that. And obviously the game itself is just beautiful. So you walk out those doors and it's a beautiful view.
I think you hit upon an interesting pair of ideas just very briefly, which is the fact that you might, and I find the same thing, I might find myself intimidated by big open world games with the sense of, I don't know where to go. I know this is going to be a time dedication. This can be a bit overwhelming. Combine that with the intimidation factor of it being a Soulsborne game, and that difficulty that you're going to have, for them to take two things that might be quite off-putting and somehow combine them together to make the game feel genuinely accessible by the standards of this video game series, it's quite the feat.
Yeah. Finding a game that is open world that still appeals to me finding a game that is aimed at high challenge gamers, people who appreciate that added difficulty. That's not me at all. I like easy. But I've been getting into Elden Ring, and I think good job making it engaging and kind of giving you that kind of subtle guidance of, yeah, you died. Maybe the reason you died is because you don't belong here in this specific instance, not in this game, but fighting this particular enemy, maybe you can come back to it later, or maybe you just need to keep trying. And I think there are a lot of times where Elden Ring kind of gives you the information to know which is which. So when you walk out the door and you do next to nothing to that tree sentinel, you're like, all right, well, maybe I'll challenge him later. But then you fight, I can't remember the name of that dungeon that's right nearby. And it's, like kind of a beast man, and I think that actually is part of his name.
It might be the beast man of Farum Azula.
That's it.
Yep.
You can like stumble into that cave and end up fighting him and realize you're doing way more than you were tree sentinel, and realize, oh, this is the type of enemy I can handle at this point. I don't need to level up and come back. And I think they did a really good job of not bludgeoning you with that information, but also not hiding it.
Perfect. And Legion. I know it might not be your favorite series or your favorite style of games, but do we have something nice we can say for 3 minutes?
Absolutely, yeah. The community that has embraced the game is not wrong. There's a reason why it works. Unlike other series where it just works, is not its tag. It actually does work. There's a specific tier of player that can grasp it very easily, but at the same time, if you have a very technically proficient player who's used to Dark Souls, will understand the mechanics and be able to take that and push the envelope a little bit more so than, say, a new player to the series. So it's one of those rare games that is able to gravitate toward your strengths and reminds you of your weaknesses. And very similar to some of the older RPGs, the original RPGs, as Banana said, there's areas that you're supposed to be going to, and then there's areas that are going to be naturally difficult. Thinking specifically of like Zelda, you could do some of those dungeons, but where they locked you is that you couldn't do certain things because you didn't have those features. You didn't maybe have bombs or something. So this game doesn't really restrict you in that manner. You basically could enter a certain area, and maybe through your skill alone you can kind of advance, but it rewards you for your exploration at the same time, which is very similar to those old RPGs. Not specifically the original Zelda, because it was even though it was open, it was fairly linear, but later installments, they would reward you for exploration. I don't want to compare the two. It's not a one-to-one, but it's just that I have certain things that I can, because I haven't played Elden Ring and it's not my type of thing. I'm not a Dark Souls player. To me, it's just not something I normally want to fire up and say that's for me. Although it's kind of funny, I do play a lot of Dark Souls light games, which I know Banana hates the term, but that's what they are. And I can dispute that term all day, but I do like a lot of games that give me the option to pause and not save necessarily, because that's kind of like the central part of them. But what I really like about Elden Ring is that it's really kind of true to its roots. It doesn't try to apologize. It is, from what I've seen and what I've been told, is that it's a little bit more accessible because it's not as hard of a game as, like, say, Bloodborne or Demon Souls or something like that. And those are the players that have played those games and have, feedback on Elden Ring. But at the same time, there are areas that are intrinsically more hard, more difficult. And so it kind of appeals to all flavors and backgrounds of players who really want to either dip their toes into a FromSoft or Dark Souls type game, and also to those who are more experienced in that background. And that's a really rare achievement. And like I said, what I like about RPGs that are open world are the ones that reward you for its exploration. The Witcher 3 was a fantastic example of that. You don't have to do this area over here. You don't have to do that area over there. There are some immersion breaking issues with that because, you know, the central theme is timing. You know, you're supposed to like find Siri and that's supposed to be your main focus. And if you're getting distracted with this place or that place, that could be a little immersion breaking, but this game doesn't have those themes going on in the background. So you're kind of able to either take your time or push through and say, I just want to see where these main bosses and areas take me, because there is some references to, you might want to go over here, you might want to go over there. Whether you choose to or not is your choice. It's not like there's a time frame involved here. It's not like you're going to, you know, after 5 days, the world will change and therefore you can't, you know, that castle's locked out or anything. That's the kind of thing that actually kind of interests me because it kind of pushes me along, but that doesn't exist in that world. And like I said, it's accessible to all backgrounds and all types. And I think the game works in that regard. So,
well, then let me draw us to one final point before we move on to our main topic. And the first one would be a simple comment. Are we really going to call it Dark Souls Light and not call it Light Souls? Come on. And the second thing, a big feature that I like in Elden Ring, and I'm curious what you think about it, because I feel over the years we see less and less of this. When you go to a new area in Elden Ring, the level will not scale to you. Enemies that are level 50 or 60 in one area remain level 50 or 60 in that area. And the loot that you find in these areas is fixed when it comes to things like treasure chests. So you have named loot in a very, very specific place. Not gear that scales to you, not enemies that scales to you. How do you feel about that? The lack of scaling in those games?
Me personally, I think that's the way it should work. If you become more powerful as a character, you should feel more powerful as a character. Games like Oblivion, Skyrim, where the enemies scale to you, you're not really progressing. You're just simply a higher level facing higher level enemies. So it's still kind of a one-to-one. It's not quite, but it's still there. Instead of facing wolves, you're facing bears, you know,
right.
Things like that. But there are certain things that sometimes the way they get around that stuff is you don't necessarily face equal level enemies, but maybe instead of one wolf, you'll run across 5 wolves, which again, you know, I could kind of make more of an argument for that, because then it requires a little bit more tactical ability to resolve that issue. Like if you're an archer at that point, facing 5 wolves is not going to be as easy as, say, somebody who has a little bit more proficiency in shielding and blocking and you know, things like that. But Elden Ring kind of scales to you as the player, and the world revolves around that. And so I don't like the steepness of it. I think it's a little, it's kind of like when you go into like an MMO and they add a new DLC or something, and suddenly the level cap is 80, so you can't reach that dungeon. I mean, I get it, but at the same time, my job is not to get to in-game level. It's just to kind of play the game and enjoy it. So I kind of like a more of a gradual increase rather than a stairway increase.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think in games where there's kind of a leveling system, it makes the most sense to me to have areas of a fixed level. That being said, I feel like I appreciate that because, again, I'm not a huge fan of open world elements. And I think if you don't have that scaling to like suit the level of the character, then a game's not really open world. You can't just go anywhere. If, you know, you take 2 steps into an area and then an enemy who's 100 levels above you just squashes you like a bug. It's not really open world.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I hate you, Final Fantasy VIII, because if I level up, I should be getting better. In Final Fantasy VIII, the enemies scale with you, but they get much better as enemies than you do as the protagonist. So leveling in Final Fantasy VIII makes the game harder, and that's the exact opposite of what you should be doing. I don't want to try and figure out a way to end a fight without gaining experience, because it's only going to get more difficult if I gain experience. I would much rather the system of, almost every other Final Fantasy game of I level up and the game gets easier.
Well, I think that's really the two perfect examples then, where you have the way that Elden Ring would do this, we would generally see as quite positive with the fixed areas, the fixed loot. We would have steps, definitely. It's not quite a slope that Legion was speaking about for the leveling between areas, but they're not too egregious. They're quite small jumps if you go in the order the game intends you to, which you don't have to, of course. And then we have the horrible counterexample of the way that Final Fantasy VIII deals with its leveling.
Are we all set? Mm-hmm. So jack in. Let's get the hell out of here. You got it. This is your big new beginning. So you have to start it like a real nomad, behind the proverbial wheel.
So, game world settings, and which one would you like to live in, basically?
Can I answer this in a surprisingly contrarian fashion? Because I think this is almost always going to be surprising, might not be the word. This might almost always be easier to find the game worlds that you wouldn't want to live in. Typically, the problem we have for a topic like this with video games is that when we enter a video game, we're normally entering that video game as some grand climactic moment is taking place, especially in things like RPGs, for the society and civilization involved. So we tend to see these very brief glimpses of the world at its zenith, at its apogee, before it immediately is ground down into dust, and we hope to try and save it. Think of something like Mass Effect, where we get at the very, very beginning this little blurb about how everything is wonderful-ish, about how society has jumped forward these enormous amounts in the last 100 years or so. But now the Reapers are coming. I would be quite all right living on the Citadel, no problem. But the whole Reaper thing puts me off. Final Fantasy VII, where am I going to be? Am I going to be up there on the disc living at high in Midgar? That doesn't sound too bad. Am I going to be down in the slums about to have the world literally fall on my head? I'm feeling less cool about the whole thing. So I think the problem we're going to have is that almost all of these worlds are so inherently broken that I don't necessarily want to go and live in it.
Well, I think, this is a classic tale for storytellers, where you have man versus man versus politics, man versus the environment. And I think you're really focused on the man versus the environment type scenario, excluding or including all that. You can definitely, we're not like I'm not discounting anything that you're saying, but there are other avenues to look at and saying, hey, look, despite all this world still appeals to me. And if I had to be in any one of these worlds, I wouldn't mind being here.
But Anna, would you like to lead us down some of these other avenues?
So I kind of had the same thoughts Com did initially, is we approach all of these worlds from the point of view of major players in the world. So Skyrim, you start off as a prisoner and you're like, this sucks. And then you realize you're the dragon. And then you're the Archmage, and then you're the Harbinger, and then you're the Master of the Thieves Guild. It's like that part of Skyrim appeals to me, the idea that you can become anything. And the Dragonborn element aside, it kind of feels like the world is set up that anybody could be in that position to just practice these skills and then become a dominant force in that world. And so something like Skyrim would appeal to me in that regard, because it seems like everyone really does have the opportunity to become something incredible, just with kind of the way the skill progression system works in Skyrim. But again, you are the Dragonborn, and that's the focus of that story. That's not going to be everyone else's experience. And so there are plenty of games set up like that where the experience of the world is kind of colored by your point of view as somebody who can change the world. But like Tom was saying, in Final Fantasy VII, if I'm living in the slums of Midgar, maybe I don't want to be in Final Fantasy VII. But, if I'm an ex-soldier like Cloud who can swing an absurdly oversized sword around and change the course of history, yeah, no, I could work with that. But I think overall, I would probably lean towards those universes where it kind of feels like you're not special until you choose to be. And that is what I would kind of prioritize. So I'd probably say something like Skyrim would be the world I would want to live in. Pretty understandable how everything works, which is something I appreciate. There's not a ton of kind of backroom politics, which is why I stayed away from my favorite game of Final Fantasy Tactics, because that is the overwhelming dominating factor of society in Ivalice. It's all political intrigue, and I have enough of that in the country that I do live in. I don't need a fantasy world version of that. Whereas in Skyrim, there are politics, but they're pretty upfront. Even the things that are kind of shameful and you would think they would try to hide, they're upfront about in Skyrim. So I think that has some appeal to me, where there's not a lot of deception. There's not a lot of, things aren't what I thought they were. And there's that clear progression of, if I want to get good at something, all I need to do is just keep doing that until I get good. And so like a universe like that appeals to me, which is, I think, why I would lean in the direction of, the Skyrim world.
I love that idea almost of Skyrim as this paragon model of social mobility. It's essentially set in Scandinavia, right?
Mhm.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to offer a little wink to the camera, by the way, for your reference to Cloud, former soldier. There we go. And then I wanted to dive into a game which I think I'd quite like to live in. And it's not a great one. It's The Sims. Because the idea of living in this world where you can start your job and within 10 days of doing nothing but turning up on time, all of a sudden you are the elite athlete. You're the spy master.
Yeah.
You're the president. I mean, admittedly, you die in around 3 weeks. So you're really getting the condensed experience. But it seems like it'd be a very comfortable way to live.
In every Sims game I've ever played, when there was that kind of progression system in your career, it was, here are the 3 specific things you need to get your next promotion. And I was like, I could do those things. All I need to do is just assign that task and work towards it. That is not how anything works in my experience in real life. So I love that.
And also think about when it comes to cleaning your apartment and so forth in real life. In The Sims, if you want to have a clean apartment, all you've got to do is put a trash bin in every room. It's as simple as that. There's no dusting. There's no vacuuming, except for fun. This is the perfect world. Why don't we just go to The Sims? Was that a different avenue?
No, that's exactly, actually, I was going to take your take and say that's kind of what I'm saying, is that you can, in this scenario, manipulate your brain a bit to say, look, this may not be the most perfect world, but these are the things that I really like about it. And it's enough that if I had to live here, I could make it work. I'm surprised Banana didn't say near automata, because there's no people.
I love Dust. Can I change my answer?
No.
I mean, it's funny because there's androids.
Well, I'm gonna hold back. I was gonna give a major spoiler, but I'll let that one go.
Yeah. They tell you very early on, because you kind of think everything looks like a person, but it's a amazingly profound philosophical argument that game is making. And so the characters that are there have a certain reason for being who they are and what they do. So definitely encourage you playing that game. But yes, there's no people in the game. They exist in the world, but you don't see them. So there was that. I thought maybe you might select that one. But we've often gone back to like sports games. So can you imagine if you were like in a sports game environment where you are the player and you get to like level yourself up in that particular avenue? So if it's a sport that you really enjoy, you could actually be in that world, you see. So there's a lot of different ways we could take this, perspective and say, I wouldn't mind being in MLB, the show.
I feel like all of this kind of ties back into our discussion of simulation games and like
Yes.
when is deviating from the reality beneficial? And in the case of when the reality is tedious and uninteresting, it's incredibly beneficial to kind of reshape it in your game. And that is what appeals to me about every one of these games. Oh yeah, they don't, like in Nier Automata, I don't have to pay a mortgage. Let's do that. That sounds awesome. Also, any game where I can like eliminate pests and get paid.
I was
feel
just
like
thinking.
every RPG where you're like, you earned 72 gold for killing rats. Like, who paid me? No, you just found it on the rats. Don't worry about it.
Think of all those times that you were outside in Final Fantasy VII, like outside Midgard, just grinding a few of those wolves just to get some levels, and then realizing how rich you've become. And you've done nothing but bully things that
Yeah.
couldn't possibly stand up to you. Where's my money for doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of simulation games. Like I like playing tavern games, to be honest. Like there's Traveler's Rest, which is kind of like a Stardew Valley version of just a tavern sim. And then there's like a tavern, I think it's just called Tavern Simulator. There's another one coming out, I think this next week that I had my eye on, but it's a fantasy setting, but yes, it's more of the first person perspective, so it's very different. But I like those type of games. But I was going to definitely default towards Mass Effect, but I think what I'm trying to say is that I really like a lot of the space games because you're able to kind of go to this world or that world. And for me, it wouldn't be No Man's Sky because I don't have any reason to be in this world or that world. I mean, there is some, but I don't really have any real impetus to have to go anywhere really in that game. You're just doing it because you want to, So for me, Mass Effect really has that appeal. Not necessarily, you can exclude all the bad things going on, of course, but just the fact that I'm able to go from here to there, and there's a reason to go from here to there, and you have all these different factions, these alien groups, you have a cohesive government that really kind of tries to tie a lot of stuff together, although not well. It actually does try to say there's a certain sense of society and an economy. So there's structure there, I think, that really kind of makes sense for me in that scenario. Even games like Starfield, you can exclude whether you like Starfield or not, or whether it's a good game or not. That's not what we're talking about. We're just saying, do you want to live in this world? I think that actually that, NASA budget conscious environment where you go to a bunker and you see like plastic bins because you're going to need some kind of method to store resources, and there's a certain logic that goes along with that. So it's realism meets futuristic type environment. So for me, it's always going to be kind of like a science space theme. I mean, look at my background. I mean,
yeah, you shock us.
but I do like the fantasy as well. So I'd be hard pressed to say, well, what if you had that, or like say like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign?
I think it's quite interesting, the idea of looking in the sci-fi worlds for somewhere to live. And there was a very telling moment, and I don't mean specifically for you, but I think for life in general and for people in general, when you were saying about No Man's Sky and there not really being a reason to go from one planet to another, except for the almost, you do it for the sake of it. Almost the vacuousness is the point. Whereas in Mass Effect, there is a very real reason to go to Novaria. What we're really looking for in our games is a search for meaning. Like, we want to just be told
Yes.
where to go, and we are desperate for life to make sense. So in that moment, I think we've unwittingly stumbled upon the real reason that we play video games and why we want to be in that world.
I think
The
it's
other
also.
thing,
Oh, I'm
you
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think it's also funny that in Legion highlighting what appeals to him in a lot of these sci-fi worlds, he mentioned the economy, and I just like my entire argument regarding just making money from fighting, enemies in whatever game was like, I want to live in a post-scarcity world where I don't have to worry about any of that stuff, and like just existing somehow earns me money. And Legion's like, no, I want there to be an economy.
Yeah, we're really seeing the divide fall down now in
Yeah.
this podcast. Banana's universal basic income, Legion's
Yeah.
dog eat dog, cutthroat sci-fi world.
Yeah.
And
Space
honestly,
communism versus space capitalism. I see.
allow me to sit here as an enlightened space centrist.
It's not a term I ever heard before.
As it crossed my tongue, I had that feeling of, this is new, this is good. But I do like how there is that wonderful thing with science fiction in particular, and with the near future of humanity's space age, for example, where it's got that romantic appeal of, it almost feels as though it's around the corner. So it feels tangible. It feels like something that with a bit of luck you might even get to live. And there are all of those wonderful little improvements in life. Like, for example, me, I'm not really a food person. Like, I will eat because I have to eat. I will eat because I know that you need X amount of calories in the day to, get through life. But I don't really have many foods that I love. So the idea of living in this sci-fi world where you can just give me a gel and I can just slurp it down and I'm done for the day, that sounds perfect. Then not having to fuel your car, nothing like that. You've got your computer, but it's actually on your wrist piece that you wear, and that shoots up and there's a big screen whenever you need it. That sounds perfect. So you've got that in those sci-fi worlds. But they almost always come, and this is the great off-putter for me, which almost says no to sci-fi immediately. They almost always seem incredibly authoritarian. Almost always. And I guess that's just the natural progression of a lot of these ideas. And we reflect, when we create these sci-fi worlds, we create these futures where there's room for conflict. Because if we had nothing but these improvements, if we had nothing but this UBI, if we had universal basic income, if we had nothing but that, then we're living in future utopia. And we need to off-balance that by having the bad. In this case, they are almost always incredibly authoritarian. And that's the one place that I really don't want to go. So I might be more likely to even lean the other way and go back into worlds that have what you might consider a Renaissance timeline, early modern timeline, a medieval timeline, a fantasy version. Because at least there's not that. Somewhere, I'm narrowing down my choice, and I will find a game by the end of this.
I do think, you've pointed out an element of this discussion that we might not have considered initially, which is all of these worlds exist because there's a narrative within those worlds that makes for a game. And overwhelmingly, that narrative can't exist without conflict. So that conflict will fall into one of a few categories, and it's typically, as Legion said, like man versus man, or man versus organization, maybe, or man versus the environment. And I think ideally, man versus environment feels the most kind of morally approachable for me. I don't want to fight other people. It's not, it doesn't appeal to me. I also don't want there to be any ambiguity of that I'm doing the right thing. So in the games where I do have to fight people, I kind of always need to feel like I'm on the right side. So like in games like Final Fantasy, everyone who is opposed to you has kind of an unambiguous motivation for evil. And I don't know if that holds up as well in the more modern Final Fantasies, but I know like Final Fantasy VII, you're rebelling against Shinra, which is a hyper authoritarian organization that is literally sucking the life out of the planet. Like there's no ambiguity there. You are the good guy despite being a terrorist.
If you think of that wonderful meme of, are we the baddies?
Yes.
There's a very clear
exactly.
answer in Final Fantasy VII. No, we're good.
Yeah.
We're cool.
Yeah, and you progress out of Midgar, and Shinra's not so much the primary bad guy. The primary bad guy summoned a meteor to destroy the planet. So still not a lot of ambiguity there.
I think he's very interested in becoming a god as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his idea is to kill everyone, including the planet, and absorb their energy to empower himself. Like, I don't feel like I ever need to explain myself to anybody when I'm just like, yeah, I'm not a fan. But I feel like in a game where it's, a little more ambiguous, a little more, well, they have legitimate reasons for being the way that they are. That doesn't appeal to me because I don't want to be wrong. I'm wrong all the time.
You could imagine if you were in the world of Mass Effect, you could imagine, at least up to a certain point, believing Saren and believing the Council and not being on Shepard's side at all and seeing him as this rogue figure, especially when he aligns himself in the second game with Cerberus.
Mhm.
You're going to be on the wrong side of history in this world. And ultimately, I think it all comes out in the wash. It's that kind of sci-fi where in the end, mostly, it's kumbaya and we move on. But you were on the wrong side of history this whole time because you made the wrong choice. That's difficult.
Now you're an Ashley apologist? Is that what?
I don't think that's what he said at all.
I'm not an Ashley apologist.
I think what we both said is that we don't want to be Solarians who neutered a species.
Right.
But
at the time,
I think that's a weird point to say, but Colin.
If you were in that world, I think you could see as a reactionary why you might lean into it.
One of the most perfect examples of there being valid points on both sides and not a clearly defined right way to handle things.
Because that goes down the road of what if. Because what if they did not?
And who gets to make that call?
But I think that's
also the weird position that puts you in.
But I think it's also a slightly enhanced version of that, where it's a situation where there are great arguments on both sides, and yet still one side seems objectively wrong. And that's a really sweet spot to be in terms of fiction. Because you can truly find yourself agreeing with both sides. But you really should fall down on one rather than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's a delicious form of ambiguity.
We'll probably table that for Mass Effect 2 because there's a lot I could say about that particular issue. And a great example
in Mass Effect 1, when you have to decide whether or not to free the Rachni Queen.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Right. But specifically, I mean, like I said, I'll table that because I do want to say because I could forget this, but when you're looking at the Shadow Broker and you find out who that is and his species, and I'm not going to spoil nothing right now, or we're not going to go into that, but that's a classic example of who the Krogan were at the time. And so, the Solarians may have had a point because actually Mass Effect 2 is trying to leverage that spot on both sides. It's not just saying the Solarians, like you said, are objectively wrong. They may have actually made the right decision. But again, that's why we're saying there are arguments to be made on both sides of that fence. So, yeah. And Com, I'm surprised that you didn't actually go with Street Fighter, because I know that you would love...
Nothing I like more than consensual violence.
Yeah.
You could do your fighting style. You could do it, Taekwondo style. You could do it with like your electrical beams or your frost beams or whatever, and
which I'm known for.
Yeah.
Plus, you get that fun little mini game where you beat up a car.
Yeah.
Yes. That might be a throwback. I don't think they kept that in more recent Street Fighter games.
I was in there thinking of the beach volleyball mode from Tekken 3, I think. I don't know if that's in there anymore.
I've changed my answer. Dead or Alive.
Dead or
beach
Alive.
volleyball.
Dead or Alive.
Oh,
I knew Banana was going to say that. Yeah.
I'm surrounded by inane perverts. What did I
How
do?
dare you? Inane?
I'm sorry to wound your delicate sensibilities, you absolute horn dog.
I mean, crossed the line.
I think for me, going back, is that I also don't have a problem. I think Baldur's Gate would be and specifically the Dungeons and Dragons Faerun universe. But the thing is that when we talk about like gaming and the environments we know, I feel like I have to give a lot of context, but I don't have the ability to. Because yes, there is a lot more to the world than just Baldur's Gate 1, 2, and 3 as far as those worlds, because of the world of Faerun is just vast and immense. You look at like Icewind Dale, and there's a whole economy there, along with a political structure and a society that incorporates different races and how they have different point of views of religion. Because you look at like humanity and how they incorporate things like Joaquin. Joaquin is a true neutral goddess, I should say, and because she's a goddess of merchants, so both merchants love her and bandits love her.
Evil,
yeah,
opposed to neutral to me.
but bandits love her too, and so you can also argue is that philanthropists love her because they're able to say, hey, look, this is what we're able to pull in for donations and things like that. So they pray to Joaquin so that they have a good source of donations, and so they can disperse that to those who need it. So that's what I'm saying is that world is such a living, breathing world. But for me, I really do like the Baldur's Gate one, mainly because, well, Vaconia. I am just like, I am a Vaconia simp. I can't help it. She is like just such an amazing character, and so if I could live in the world, hey Vicky, how you doing?
I was about to look down on you, and then I realized how many gifs of Tifa Lockhart I've sent in the last few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I have no moral high ground.
I feel like the Dungeons and Dragons one, or anything kind of based around Dungeons and Dragons, is a weird one because it's that same situation where we talk about, like I was saying with Skyrim, where you're just kind of nobody originally, and you find out you're the Dragonborn, but that's not the sum of your abilities. In Dungeons and Dragons, unless you're a player character, you probably have 10 in all stats and 4 hit points. Which means it's incredibly likely that you're going to die by accident from one of these adventurers who just let something get away from them. And that doesn't appeal to me.
I mean, that is always one of the terribly interesting things that I find when we do talk about these worlds, is the sheer amount of people in them who are having a miserable life. Genuinely miserable. And I'm thinking as well, and this, you wouldn't find so much today, I think, where you have RPGs and so forth and have a lot of the background characters, they'll have their daily routines and their schedules. But I'm thinking of there's games that we've played over the years where a town will have, say, 4 buildings and 30 NPCs. Where do they live? I don't want to be one of them. Yeah. And this genuine, like, that's a bit facetious, but this genuine sense of impoverishedness that you find in many of these worlds, and how openly racist they can be, openly sexist they can be, whatever it was, they just mostly seem like terrible, terrible places to live. And I begin to realize that choosing a sci-fi world for me is off the cards for the reasons mentioned earlier. And choosing a low fantasy world is now off the cards as well. I think I need a JRPG. I think I need that. I'm narrowing down.
I need a game with a character creation menu.
Where you get to re-roll for your stats, right?
Yeah, and that's actually exactly what I was going to go with. Because we talked about Baldur's Gate, and in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, you can just re-roll your stats until you get a total that you want, and then allocate them wherever you want. I would love that. Also, just getting to choose what you look like is absurdly undervalued. I mean, if you look at the industries that exist in the real world to kind of get you moving in the right direction of what you want to look like, and then you load up a game and instantly you're like, no, I want to be that. Like, I want to be the most physically appealing human being in existence, and it's entirely possible.
And my Baldur's Gate
just
character
start like that. I just
my Baldur's Gate, yeah, my character doesn't work out, and they didn't have an awkward teenage phase.
Yes.
They're just born into the world as a 34-year-old hottie. It's perfect.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Baldur's Gate now.
But yeah, I think the character creation menu might be the deciding factor. Like, which character creation menu is the best one, and then leads into a universe where I could get by.
Yeah, because you say that, like, unless you're a player character, but, you know, there are multiple enemies or potential enemies because they're actually NPCs that if you make hostile could become your enemy, but they have stats. So when you run into them, they may not be the greatest of stats, but because there's, you know, 8 of them against you, then it's a conflict. And so I guess my point here is that it's a living, breathing world, and it feels tangible, it feels real, but in a malleable way. So I think that's why it really kind of has a certain, not just as a tabletop, because that's obviously where it came from, but the games have really been able to tap that feeling, that environment, and say, even in the earlier games, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, you're able to kind of flesh out in your mind's eye. I keep referring to the mind's eye, but you're able to kind of like take those things and say, and extrapolate it into your own imagination and say, you know, I fought the sailor bandit lord who's behind the hidden wall area there, and I wouldn't have done that if I didn't have the stats that I have and able to like talk to him, or maybe I could join him, you know. And so it's one of those things that the environment really is indicative of what you would want to, a world that you may want to like actually be part of, because it's exciting and it's different.
What's the murder rate in Baldur's Gate? The city itself, it seems like pretty high.
So Baldur's Gate,
well, if
City,
you do the murdering,
yeah,
they respond pretty quickly. If it's anyone but you, no one cares.
Yeah, I don't want to live there.
Yeah.
Well, Baldur's Gate City is hard for me to comment on because of the lore.
Because it's you doing all the killing. Yeah.
There's,
and for the upcoming court case, you really can't comment.
It's not just the fact that
my lawyers have advised me not to participate in this podcast.
Yeah, it's not like Zelda where, like, you know, Link is going around like killing all these like things and these NPCs and stuff. It's not like that. It's actually a central part of the subject of the game. So, but I will say that if we're talking about lore-wise, Baldur's Gate City is not that large, not compared to like some of the other nearby cities, like even Neverwinter Nights, Neverwinter City. And so you take certain aspects of Baldur's Gate, and it's much more concentrated, you know, so everybody's kind of in those walls. So it's more of like a everybody knows each other. So you couldn't get away with a lot more as you could in, say, other cities. So specifically Baldur's Gate City itself, probably the murder rate is not super high, but it's also a lot of, you have a lot of factions that work underground. So, yeah.
Also, there's a literal murdering ogre mage underground.
Mm-hmm.
And most murders are committed by people who know each other.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still not sold on Baldur's Gate.
But to be fair, in Baldur's Gate, you can just choose Fighter, Mage, Thief, and max all your stats, and just be the most powerful person in the world.
Well, then we're back to where we were. The grand circle has been completed almost. If we get to choose who we are in the world, then honestly, for me, it's easy. It's Final Fantasy VII, and I don't want to be Cloud. I just want to be Cid. Cid seems like they've got an easy life. Like they know.
I love how you chose the character who is bitter from the moment you met him. Like you talk to him and he tells you to get the fuck out.
Right.
No, I should have seen this coming hours ago.
Yeah, the people in the comments will be saying, "How did you not see this coming?
Yeah.
What's wrong
in
with
that
you?"
Case, I want to be Vincent.
You want to be
And
Vincent?
nobody ever visits the mansion.
Vincent in a world without Cloud.
Yes.
It's perfect. I think I found the world I want to live in, by the way. And it's probably says a lot about my psychological development. I want to live in the nice, safe, cartoony world of Dragon Quest XI. Put me there. It's fine. If I don't leave town, I'll never see monsters. If I do see monsters, they actually look kind of cute and cartoony. I can live with this. There's money everywhere. You just got to pick up people's plant pots and throw them. I want to be in that world.
Considered that. Every Zelda world just became more appealing because I can just roll into a pot and potentially become rich.
You're
and then
rewarded.
leave the room and come back and that pot exists again. And it might be full of money again.
You're rewarded for vandalism. It's not a crime, it's a job.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure we'll have like a viewer or listener who's like, I can't believe, I would love to be in the world of like Elden Ring. They love the struggle. They love, the environment. And it makes sense to me. It's like, hey, look, that's what they loved. It's a beautiful environment, but excluding that, I mean, there's a lot of things that you could, tangibly say that is real to them. It's actually visceral. It creates a visceral reaction, I should say. Similarly, I would not choose personally Dragon Age over, say, Dungeons and Dragons universe, because it's more of a struggle bus in Dragon Age. and if I'm picking a sci-fi world, I'd want Mass Effect versus, say, Star Wars. It doesn't seem like there would be much of a dividing line, but to me, it's black and white. I wouldn't mind being in the Star Wars world, but I will say that for me, the greatest MMO that I ever played, the one that I thought was just absolutely fantastic, was Star Wars Galaxies. So that's a throwback to, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I don't have time to go over that, but you could be anything. You could be a dancer, you could be a clinician, you could be a tailor, you could be an architect. And until they incorporated Jedis, it really broke the system. But really, it was a living, breathing world. I mean, you were basically just a person in Star Wars, and it really, really, really worked. But unfortunately, in the world of Star Wars, a lot of times it's just not how it's projected. So if I could take Star Wars Galaxies, I probably would like that, because I've seen it work. It does work. It's a really great environment and ability to conceive of a world and see it functional and be able to take that next step and just say, I could live here.
If you think about the difference between Mass Effect and Star Wars, if I was gonna live in one of those two worlds, I would also choose Mass Effect over Star Wars. But I think for me the reason is actually quite straightforward, and it's Star Wars is a massively, if you were to be transported into that world now, you would be massively shocked by how daily life is. There's almost no common ground, whereas Mass Effect is essentially us, but 130 years in the future, whatever it might be. So you have a lot of common ground still there. You're probably even going to still have the Beatles if you really want to go and find a record and listen to it. So you've got that beautiful, straightforward familiarity. It's just us time warped forward. Star Wars, learning all these new species that you might be having to live with on a daily basis. That sounds pretty hard. At least in Mass Effect, you're probably still surrounded by a whole bunch of humans as well, just because we haven't moved forward that much. So that familiarity, I think, would be a lot more welcoming than the complete change of scenery that Star Wars would give you.
I also feel like, and this might just be my lack of understanding of the Star Wars universe, but I feel like Star Wars in particular, with regards to the Force, is not so well defined as to how things work and what the limitations are. So I think there are plenty of examples of very unique powers being discovered by Force users and those kind of being limited to a single person who devoted a lot of effort to developing that power. And I think that kind of means those limits don't really exist. And I'm not particularly enthusiastic about living in a world where a crazy space wizard might just blow us all up because he learned a new trick. But
Well,
that being said, if I'm a crazy space wizard, that sounds awesome.
I think that's an inherent fundamental concern of living in almost any of these worlds, and it would go for all fantasy and pretty much all sci-fi, is it's the most stringent divided haves and have-nots that you will ever find.
Mhm.
And especially that Star Wars example of the Force, because as I understand it, you've either got it or you don't. And if you don't, there's nothing you can ever do to offset that balance. You can't become a Force user as time goes on. I think Mass Effect is similar, right? Where at a very young age, the biotic work and training and implanting, whatever it might be, has to be done then. And unless there's this one outlier character in the lore somewhere, no one's becoming a biotic in their 30s. That's just your time has passed. And if you think of all these fantasy worlds, the wizards are the wizards, the mages are the mages. And if you can't do it, you can't do it. And there's plenty of things that you could say in our world is very much of the have and the have not. Very much. But that feels so cold that the Force, yes or no. Biotic, yes or no. And having almost no crossover between the two. I don't want to live in the world with the crazy space wizards.
I don't want to get grilled by the Star Wars listeners, viewers.
Banana does.
But I mean, the Force was stronger with a lot of individuals further back in history that you go. But then that gets into the whole Legends canon, and that's where I get really frustrated because there's so much that are in the Legends canon that just makes sense. And then when Disney took it over, all that went away and they created their own canon, which has a lot of holes in it. Now they've been starting to patch some of those holes, but it worked before. It really didn't need to be said, hey, look, that stuff we're not counting that stuff anymore. We're going to create a whole new universe. You don't need to. It's there. It's been built. But back then, you had a lot of people who, like you said, either have it or you don't have it. But the thing is that even if you were a minor Force user, you could, similar to a weightlifter, you could work on it. You could actually start building it. It was flexible. What you put into it is what you could get back. Now, yes, you may have a certain genetic predisposition to only get so far, but you could actually figure out what your talents were and focus on that. So if you were more of if you just grew to be an aesthetic weightlifter, well, maybe that's what you want to focus on, bodybuilding. If you wanted to say, hey, look, I clearly it doesn't take much for me to build strength. Well, that's what you could focus on. The Force was very much like that. But as time went by, the universe started to kind of balance out. And so when they start talking about how balance in the Force occurs, that's part of it. So you had a lot of Force users who were just not as powerful anymore, even if they worked on it, because the Force would just naturally balance itself out. So you couldn't have the ability to push through. And that's why individuals like Luke, for instance, they are the outliers because they are bringing the true balance and they're exceptionally powerful to begin with. So it's really hard to comment on the Star Wars universe because, like I said, I'm going to get grilled. I'm like, no, you're completely wrong. That's not how the Force works. Okay, but I'm very agreeable.
I think you honestly, though, when you mentioned that you don't want to talk about it, because the reactions one can get from Star Wars fans, I think as soon as you railed on Disney, you're preaching to the choir. You got them all back on side immediately. We're good.
I think the Star Wars is that kind of perfect example of the haves and have-nots, given the direction that the more recent movies have gone, where it seems like the major players can trace their genealogy to powerful Force users. And it's like, oh, great. So not only was Anakin incredibly powerful, but Anakin's kids are incredibly powerful now. And then Rey's genealogy plays into that. It's just like, all right. The fun thing about the Force was kind of not knowing what it meant to be a Force sensitive. So if you just look at the original trilogy that was released, they didn't really go into what it meant to be force sensitive. You just knew that Luke could use the force. And it wasn't necessarily because his father was a force user, because Leia never really played into that conversation in the original trilogy. So maybe it was just chance that Anakin and Luke were powerful. And that made it fun. And then the prequel trilogies come along and they introduce midichlorians. You're like, okay, I don't care anymore. This sucks. I want to go back to the fun part where I didn't know how this worked, and maybe I'm a force user.
Well, like I said, I could get easily grilled because when you bring up somebody like Leia, it's like I said, it's all part of the whole Legends canon stuff. Yeah, she may not have been a central figure in the movies. However, she does have certain talents that are known to people who kept up with the Star Wars universe back then. And, leadership, like for instance, Bastila in the KOTOR, she was a force user, but her main force power was the ability to get into the minds of her allies and inspire them. I mean, you don't think of that as like a force ability, but she's manipulating the battlefield in their favor, because even if they have lower numbers, she's able to inspire them and they fight harder. So a squadron of, say, 10 guys may fight like 100. So it kind of levels the battlefield. So that's kind of what I was saying, is that, yes, I would probably get grilled by people like, that's not how the force works. And when you would see Leia in the movies and she's doing certain things like, I can't believe it. That's not believe it or not. Actually, it's, even though Disney may have gotten a lot of things wrong, they actually kind of got that right. But anyway, now I'm back on this side.
That example is another universe where I have no interest in the nonsense that's going on, where Obi-Wan takes Luke and Leia away, and Luke goes to live in a moisture farm with his aunt and uncle, and Leia becomes a princess. Like, really? That's where he's literally a dirt farmer and Leia is a princess. Like, how did you decide where they're both going to go?
The Force told him. Banana.
Yeah. Force is stupid.
That's not how the Force works.
Every time I get into a conversation like, that's not how the Force works, it kind of is, because the way the Force works doesn't make any sense. If you take every piece of information about the Force, it's not consistent. It can't be the way the Force works. So it's really just the Force works however the writers decide it does in that moment.
But that's what I'm saying. Coming full circle, I could not live in the, well, I mean, I could obviously, but I wouldn't choose to live in the Star Wars universe. Although it sounds kind of crazy with the whole, how popular it is. And like, it's one of the major Disney World attractions.
I'm lost on the idea of it being a popular choice. Like, people would want to live there. Is a massive imperial fascistic space empire.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds horrible. The idea that anyone would want to live in that would surprise me. I can imagine people enjoying the romanticism of the stories and the narratives, but I think anyone, if you dove into it for more than about 2 minutes with them, do you really want to live there? Star Wars would fall out very quickly, unless you happen to be a space wizard, Jedi,
or rogue. I mean, that's the appeal of Han Solo, is he's working outside of the system. He's working with, say, neutral groups like the Hutts, for instance, and so he's able to carve out a living doing what he wants and being that rebel influence, but
I don't want to be him.
Yeah.
Well,
I just want to be Han Solo. That's all I ever wanted.
I think that's another reason why I wouldn't want Star Wars, just because of that inconsistency where you have space wizards, people with absurd power who could do unreasonable things, and then they go up against bounty hunters that are just people with guns, and sometimes they lose. And it's just like, hold on a second. You have pretty much limitless power, and Jake over there got a lucky shot in, and now Jake is a legend.
But you all know about Jake. Jake's the fucking man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the inherent the inherent internal inconsistency of the logic of the world would be slightly off-putting if I had to live there. When all of a sudden, like you say, this Jedi is the world's most powerful wizard, and now he got shot, and now he's dead.
Yeah. And I
Bearing
think
in mind that
it goes
can happen,
back
of
to that.
course, but they have lightsabers.
Yeah. It goes back to that element of the narrative. Because if you set up the rules for Star Wars and you defined how the Force works, you're basically giving every Force user a huge advantage over the normal population, and that limits what you can do with a story.
Mm.
So if I've watched the Clone Wars series recently, and there are tons of times where Anakin and Obi-Wan are sent to a location, and it's just people who have been living there like outside of communication with most of the universe for a long time, and they manage to handle Jedi very well. And it's just like that story needed to exist because you're making a TV show, but that story doesn't make any sense.
You know, I think we've talked now for about 25 minutes about exclusively Star Wars.
Yeah, as Legion has been saying, like, I don't want to get into, we're gonna piss off a lot of people. I'm just like, Star Wars sucks.
I'm going to take the bold assertion of Star Wars is fine. It's
Star Wars
good.
is a wonderful, wonderful sandbox to
Mhm.
have fun with the way the universe works and come up with fun ideas.
Right.
But as soon as you start putting rules into place or you start fixating on details, it doesn't hold up anymore.
I'm going to agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Legends really captured that. That's kind of why I keep going back to Legends, because there's a lot of planets and societies that use the Force differently, and they're able to. They're not Jedi, they're not Sith, but they're still able to use this space magic in a way that best suits them and their culture. You don't really see that as much in the newer stuff. It's more like they're all variations of the same theme. But Calm also, I mean, you know, in the Dungeons and Dragons universe, you can be a bard. You can be a bard and then influence people and then cast certain spells
and seduce dragons.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering at what point that line crosses over from sexy to sinister.
That's your choice.
Travel around manipulating people by
any universe where like a charm person spell exists feels a little morally ambiguous now.
Yeah, I'm all for charming people, but I want to do it the hard way. You know, I want to do it the natural way, not just I cast my +2 my +2 loot at LUTE, and now you must. I don't want to live in that world. That bit's probably getting edited.
Probably for the best.
You know what's really, I've done this in Baldur's Gate 3, is that you don't actually see a lot of people play this way because it makes no sense whatsoever. But for me, I'm not trying to break the game. I'm not one of those type players. I'm just an immersive type player. But you can get a lute, a harp or whatever, you know, a flute.
I knew it.
And you can have no proficiency in music whatsoever and start playing, and people will like cover their ears and they'll make comments how bad you are, and you're playing bad. There's actually music that accompanies
you
it.
can do that in the real world.
Yeah, but that's kind of my point, is that it takes that immersion to that next level. It doesn't simply just say, you know, well, because you've done the action in the game, there's a default reaction that the game puts out there for you. It actually scales to your level of proficiency, which I didn't think they had to do, but I'm glad that they did.
So do we know which world we want to live in? Did we find
I feel like I know less now than I did.
Yeah, I'm lost. I'm just thinking about Jedi.
It's clearly Bloodborne or Resident Evil. So.
Oh. I mean, Resident Evil.
Resident Evil, I'm going to be a zombie in like 3 minutes.
Doesn't sound that bad. Honestly, it's over and done with. Do zombies know what's going on, or are they just dead for all intents and purposes?
I think they're just dead.
That's fine. We're old now. We all beg for the sweet release. No, like that wouldn't be as bad as I think as like if you imagine just somewhere where you were stuck living forever in this horribly impoverished world. Give me that or Resident Evil, and I'm saying zombie bite my face. It's yours.
Yeah.
I would imagine perhaps actually the best one of these worlds to live in is probably going to be a horror game, as long as you live in that first 5 minutes when everything's perfect. I mean, Alan Wake, when his life was together, doesn't seem that bad.
Yeah, the
I don't want
quarry.
to be an Alan Wake.
The quarry was
feel
pretty
like,
good at the beginning.
We kind of ignored one of the main elements of the Dark Souls games, which is that basically that is the ultimate example of a meritocracy. Is that if you can kill everyone else, you get to take your place at the top of the world.
Can I add to it actually one big negative of Dark Souls? Oh my goodness, people are going to think this that I'm very sad. I'd like to point out I'm fine. You never get to die in Dark Souls. You just have to live on being murdered again and again and again, and you just have to keep coming back and walking those same corridors over and over. It sounds like the worst thing in the world. And you know, when your character dies because he's been like set on fire or stabbed through or eaten by a giant snake or whatever, in the game it's just, oh, that's annoying. If you are that person, you have to get eaten by a giant snake and then get up and do it again. This is horrible.
Yeah.
That's a real dark idea.
Yeah. I would definitely avoid Dark Souls for both of the reasons that we just mentioned. One, because meritocracy sounds nice, but it's actually not great.
Well, no one wants to be the one at the bottom, do they?
Yeah, exactly. And two, any game that has that kind of like slow decay for eternity, I don't want to do that. And Dark Souls does, and Bloodborne and all of those, it's not just like a physical decay. You slip into madness as well. And I deal with enough madness in the finite time I have. I don't need that to go on forever.
Yeah. Silent Hill also would be in that same vein.
Yeah, absolutely not with Silent Hill. I don't need physical manifestations of my interior struggle. The interior struggle is painful enough. I don't need that to become a monster and try to kill me.
So PT's off the table as well, I imagine.
Most horror games are off the table for me. I'm sticking with Sims.
Yeah. Do we just agree that we want to be in The Sims?
Yeah.
The
Video games are
anti-Dark Souls?
terrifying. This is an awful question.
Yeah. I still think for me the Baldur's Gate universe. If I can't do fantasy, I would definitely do Mass Effect universe. It's not just it's my favorite series. I think there's a reason why it's my favorite series, that I can really extrapolate my imagination into that world and do just fine. Yeah.
I think Mass Effect is another wonderful sandbox, but they also did a great job with the story of the original trilogy.
Yeah.
So like the existence of biotics, the existence of this hyper futuristic tech, that's really appealing. That's a fun place to kind of just think about and fantasize. The story of Mass Effect is also very well done, which is kind of not the same direction that I was saying the Star Wars has gone in, but I feel like that's why Legion and I were so disappointed with Andromeda, is because this universe was so well done and so fun in just all of the possibilities. And then we got Andromeda. And then years passed and I can't even remember what happened because it was so disappointing.
For anyone, by the way, who would like to know more about our opinions on Mass Effect, we do have a Mass Effect podcast that we've previously done, and you can find that in our playlists.
What about, as far as one more space world, what about Halo? No?
No.
A bit too militaristic for my tastes.
I'm, without a doubt, I'm going to end up being Jenkins. It's just, that's what's going to happen to me in all of these worlds.
Well, in this, you do get to see actually when we're picking what world we want to live in, you do get to see how much of an egoist and a narcissist we are. Because if we're picking a very militaristic world or a very dangerous world, and we're thinking, yeah, I fancy my chances, we're probably quite vainglorious.
Yeah.
Whereas Banana has just gone entirely the other way. Oh no, I know I haven't got a chance. Don't put me in there. I'm not going to be fine. Halo, I would hate to be in
I
that
just
world.
feel like in every one of these games, there's always that one person who is that pinpoint where you discover what it is you're up against. And I feel like I'm gonna be that guy.
But when I get the feeling though that when you do die in that story, the audience is going to be crushed. Like, there's going to be
Yeah,
sad
but I'm still
music.
dead.
I know, but think of the sacrifice you've made in my hero's journey.
Yeah, in your hero's journey. My hero's journey, on the other hand, is, hey, what's that? And
I think one other world, I love the cyberpunk theme. I don't love the cyberpunk world. And for obvious reasons, I don't need to be very specific about it. Obviously, it's a very dystopian world. However,
anyone who looks at the cyberpunk world will immediately know what you mean.
yeah, but there is a certain interesting thing about it, because it's not steampunk. It's almost kind of like steampunk for future lovers, I guess, because there's a lot of things that people love about steampunk, right? And you take cyberpunk, which is again in that whole dystopian type world, but there's a lot of things to really like about it. It lets you as a person enhance yourself. If you have bad vision like I do, I could just get new cyber eyes and it's fixed. But I think, like I said, there's certain little things about it. It's not that it's like an immediate gratification here. Suddenly we're better, right? But there is that element that's appealing, because yes, I could say in Star Wars it's such a futuristic, even though it's thousands of years ago, but it is futuristic. It's a science, and we could say Mass Effect. Nobody's wearing really glasses in Mass Effect that I can remember. So we're assuming that
Shaq must wear glasses.
I don't think so. That was the first thought I had as well, and I don't think she does.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah, so we're assuming that the technology is to a point where it's fixed those things, but it's never addressed. It's not in any lore. But Cyberpunk is actually saying, look, that this is how we do things, and I think there's a certain realism there that I could kind of gravitate to and say, what if we have, because obviously aging is one of those things that they've fixed. You could have somebody who's 120 years old and they look 30, in Cyberpunk. So there's a certain appeal out there for some of those
Let me
things.
offer you my final thought on the cyberpunk approach to this. So in Mass Effect, you don't see anyone wearing glasses. So let's make that assumption that essentially ocular degeneration, we've managed to solve that. No one has cataracts anymore. All of these issues have been long since dealt with. I think in Mass Effect, that's what's happened. Cyberpunk seems like the kind of world where someone's going to sell you bad eyes, where you're going to be defrauded, where it's going to be a con, where it's going to be a trick. It feels like that, where the technology does exist. At the very, very top, you could have it, but then you're going to have these sort of black market operations on the lowest level, where goodness knows actually what's going to end up going inside of your head. And again, it's another world that I just couldn't bear the thought of living in.
I feel like that is Cyberpunk plays into the same kind of, I don't want to call them tropes, but because that's I feel a little inaccurate, but the ideas that are used in Altered Carbon, if anyone is familiar with that. And it's basically the idea that when you kind of progress to the point where mortality fades away a little bit, or people are able to kind of extend their own lives, you end up with that more stark contrast between the haves and have-nots, because wealth that one person accumulates is then leveraged to continue growing for that one person who now doesn't go away. So you end up with this much harsher divide between the people who have succeeded previously or have, whatever they've done, sacrifice their morals to exploit other people, or however they manage to accumulate their wealth. They now have it and no one else can, because they're there forever. And in Cyberpunk, it feels maybe not so cut and dry because they're not there forever, but it's that much more difficult to break that divide.
But also, I'd enjoy the idea as well, what Legion mentioned and now what you've elaborated on, of extending lifespans. The idea of, and I think this is addressed in Mass Effect with the Solarians in particular, the idea of progress is largely defined by the idea that we are mortal and we're going to die at some point. If you want to do something in your life as a human, you've got about 70 years to do it. If suddenly you've got 150, it doesn't feel quite so pressing that you get something done. If you've got 300, it's not quite so pressing, and so on, so forth. So I could also imagine these societies, when people start to live a lot longer, really just starting to stagnate. As people realize they don't have to really move their asses to get things done. And I think, if I remember correctly, the Solarians, that's part of their vibe. The way they talk that bit quicker is they're fitting things into their shorter lifespans. The way that they get so advanced scientifically is they just dedicate themselves to this.
Who is the one person in Mass Effect 1 and 2 that is given their own soliloquy besides Shepard? It's Kirrahe. Hold the line. It's more important to them.
Singer of Toto.
Yeah.
Fuck off.
A joke is going to land with like 3 people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sadly, one of them was here and didn't like it.
Yeah.
But it's more important to them because it means more, because their lifespans are so short that, I mean, to them, it's a normal lifespan, obviously. But when when we see like the Krogan, the Asari live to be 1,000 years old. In reverse, though, it's like when they decide to get married or something, it's a permanent decision because they're going to be living for so long. But the Solarians are given a little bit more respect, I guess, because their decisions are hard decisions because they don't have as much of a lifetime to make those decisions. So
you also have the extra greater almost tragedy of when an Asari chooses to sacrifice themselves, because you're seeing now a lifespan of thousands of years, I think it's thousands, essentially being lost. All of these things that one person could have gone on and done are gone, whereas the Solarian, it's 20 years. He was only going to make it to 40 and he's 33. If an Asari is 33, they're a child. So you lose that big future, and I think you find that in Tolkien's work. I think sometimes you often find the gravity of losing an elf is much greater than the gravity of losing a human. I think also those societies, though, where people live lasting for thousands of years, they by definition are going to have lower birth rates. Just by definition, unless they really want to sort of overload. So also within this one person, you're losing a slightly greater portion of society, quite literally, than you do with something like the Solarians, and all of that person's inherited knowledge, culture, etc., is all suddenly gone.
As much as I love Tolkien and the world that he built, where we have all of our fantasy coming from, I don't know if I want to live in any of the Lord of the Rings universes.
It would be another one I wouldn't particularly want to. That massive divide between races, in particular, the orcs stuck underneath their mountains where they are a defined Dark Lord. That sounds pretty bad. The elves living in their little, racial paradise. That sounds terrible. An afterlife across the continent that only some of these things actually get to go to and others don't get to by account of being the wrong race. It sounds like a terrible world to be in. I do not want to be a part of that. Banana?
Oh no, I completely agree. The world, I think, is incredible from a distance. I don't want to be a part of it. The idea that these absurdly powerful creatures who exist in kind of this extraplanar realm decided to come to Middle Earth and start messing stuff up, and we just have to deal with it. I'm not on board with that, because again, I'm gonna be Jenkins. I'm gonna get screwed over by this system.
I'm going to say this is coming, and I think from Banana as well, but from me, that's coming from someone who loves Lord of the Rings. It's one of my favorite great pieces of fiction, but rightly said, I want that at a safe distance from me. I'm happy to be an observer. I don't want to be in there.
Yeah. Best case scenario, I'm Boromir in Lord of the Rings.
That's really best case.
Yeah. That's where I see all of these like stories playing out. So, final answer, I'm going to say Outriders, because the main character dies, and that is their pathway to becoming a superhero.
There we go.
I'm gonna die.
And I'm going to go full circle, and it's really tragic because I said at the beginning that I didn't want to be in this world, but screw it. I want to be in Final Fantasy VII because I like it there. But I do insist that I'm rich and I'm living on the plate in Midgar, profiting from the spoils of the planet and the people below me.
Yeah, screw it. Elden Ring with cheats on.
Bam! Legion, where are you going to be?
I'm still going to be stuck in Baldur's Gate, that whole Sword Coast area. But I do like the idea of traveling between Neverwinter and Baldur's Gate. And then, I don't know what I would be doing necessarily, but at least I have the ability to focus on whatever my attributes would be. If my charisma score is 19, I'm gonna be doing something with that.
I am gonna stick with my Skyrim original, just because there's in-game mechanics that let me break reality. Skyrim lets me live out my power fantasy of making the world a better place, just by putting in the effort.
All right,
perfect.
Well, I think we covered all those things pretty well. I'm really looking forward to any comments or suggestions that
I am not so much looking forward to
Star Wars fans were listening.
Yeah. So again, if you're listening to it on any one of our audio sources, Spotify, Apple, we're also on Amazon Music. We do have a YouTube channel, so like, subscribe, make as many comments as you want there. Give us some suggestions. If you have a topic for the future that you want to cover, definitely put it in there. We read all comments. So without further ado, we will check you guys next time. Bye.